On February 17, 1974, Carla Walker, a 17-year-old high school cheerleader, was abducted from a bowling alley parking lot. That night, she was out with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. The two had attended a dance at Western Hills High School before ending up in his car, parked in the lot. Without warning, a man approached, assaulted Rodney, knocking him unconscious, and dragged Carla away. By the time Rodney came to his senses, Carla was gone. In the frantic minutes that followed, he rushed to her home, waking her parents and telling them what had happened. But it was too late. 3 days later, Carla's body was found, beaten, tortured, raped, and strangled to death, discarded in a drainage ditch 30 minutes south of Fort Worth. The case went cold. The police scoured the area, searched for leads, and questioned every possible suspect. But nothing pointed to the killer. No one could explain why Carla had been chosen. The killer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a mystery that would haunt her family for decades. But the investigation didn't end there. Though the case seemed unsolvable, detectives kept working, never willing to let go of the truth that still eluded them. Then, in 2020, something unexpected happened. A new era of technology had arrived: DNA testing. Investigators sent evidence from Carla's clothing, kept preserved for decades, to a specialized lab. The technology had advanced far beyond what was available in the 70s. Finally, a breakthrough came. The DNA recovered from Carla's clothes matched someone who had been living in the community all along, a man no one had suspected. Glen Samuel McCurley, a man who had lived in Fort Worth for years, who had blended into the background of daily life. No one had ever looked at him twice. The name McCurley was familiar to the police. In 1974, he had been interviewed as part of the investigation. At the time, he had mentioned that he owned a .22 Ruger pistol, similar to the one used in the abduction. He even claimed it had been stolen from his truck. But after taking a polygraph test and passing it, he was cleared as a suspect. But the DNA told a different story. The evidence didn't lie. McCurley had not only owned the gun, but had been the one to use it on that fateful night. As police obtained more DNA evidence, including samples from outside his home, they confirmed what they already feared. Glen McCurley was the man who had taken Carla Walker's life. The arrest shocked the community. McCurley had lived quietly, seemingly without a dark past. He had never aroused suspicion. He had been just another neighbor, a man no one would have guessed was capable of such violence. McCurley had a history of violence, but it wasn't until the murder investigation was reopened that his dark side began to surface. Though he was never charged for other crimes, investigators believed he may have been involved in the rapes and murders of other young women in the Fort Worth area during the 1970s and 80s. Yet there was no concrete evidence to charge him. When McCurley was arrested in 2020, he was 77 years old. The decades that had passed since the murder didn't change the fact that he was now facing the consequences for a crime he had committed nearly half a century earlier. But McCurley refused to admit guilt at first. He only pleaded guilty in 2021 after his trial began, changing his plea on the third day. Why did he do it? Why did he commit such a heinous act? Even after his guilty plea, McCurley refused to acknowledge his responsibility, telling a reporter he had had enough hounding. It seemed that he had lived with the weight of the crime for so long. The pressure of the investigation finally broke him. For Carla's family, the truth came far too late. They had spent 46 years without closure, without justice. The man who had destroyed their daughter's life had been walking free, living a normal life, while they were left to suffer. The trial was only the final chapter of this long, drawn-out saga. As McCurley was sentenced to life in prison, Carla's family could finally begin to heal, knowing that the man who had stolen their daughter from them would never harm another person again. Yet questions still linger. What drove McCurley to commit such an awful act? How had he managed to hide in plain sight for so many years? The answers may never fully come. But one thing is clear. The case of Carla Walker's murder serves as a reminder that justice, even when delayed, can eventually be served. In July 2023, McCurley died in prison, leaving behind a legacy of horror, the final chapter of a crime that had shattered a family. For Carla's parents, the relief came far too late, but at least the truth was finally known. Carla Jan Walker was just 17 years old when her life was violently taken. A cheerleader, a bright young woman full of potential, she had dreams of a future ahead of her. But on February 17, 1974, that future was stolen in a brutal, senseless act. Carla was abducted from the parking lot of a bowling alley in Fort Worth, Texas, after attending a school dance with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. What began as a simple night out turned into a nightmare that would haunt not only Carla's family but an entire community for decades. The police quickly pieced together the horrific details. Carla had been violently attacked, dragged away from her boyfriend, and her body was discovered days later in a drainage ditch, miles away from the scene of the abduction. She had been brutally beaten, tortured, and raped before being strangled to death. Despite initial leads and evidence, the case went cold. The man responsible for this heinous crime had vanished, slipping through the cracks of the investigation. For 46 long years, the case remained unsolved. For decades, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The case seemed to slip through the hands of law enforcement at every turn, even as they gathered physical evidence. But in 2020, after nearly 5 decades, a breakthrough came. The discovery of a new tool, DNA technology, finally made it possible to catch the killer, a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. So what happened? How did the killer evade justice for so long? How did this case, one that seemed destined to remain unsolved, finally crack open and reveal the shocking truth? In the next few moments, we'll walk through the intense investigation that led to the resolution, one that still has the community reeling. The journey from a cold case to a resolution is one that defies expectations, and it begins with the chilling discovery that changed everything. It all started on the night of February 17, 1974, in a dimly lit parking lot outside Brunswick Ridge Le Bowl in Fort Worth. Carla and her boyfriend Rodney had just attended a dance at Western Hills High School. The evening had been a typical teenage night, innocent, carefree, filled with laughter. They sat together in Rodney's car, talking, enjoying each other's company. The world outside seemed safe, familiar, a place they had both known their entire lives. But in an instant, their normalcy was shattered. Without warning, the car door was ripped open. A man, armed with a gun, attacked Rodney. The gun's magazine fell to the ground in the chaos. Rodney was pistol-whipped, rendered unconscious in the blink of an eye. When he came to, Carla was gone. He could remember her frantic screams as she was dragged away by the stranger. A few moments later, she was gone without a trace. Rodney, disoriented and bleeding, managed to get help. He rushed to Carla's parents, desperately telling them what had happened. The police arrived soon after, launching a search for Carla. The only tangible evidence left behind was a purse and the gun's magazine, both of which were found in the parking lot. But there was no sign of the attacker, and no indication of where Carla had been taken. As the search for Carla intensified, it became clear. Someone had carefully planned this abduction, and they had left very little behind. 3 days later, Carla's body was discovered, discarded like garbage, in a drainage ditch near Lake Benbrook, about 30 kilometers from the bowling alley. The autopsy revealed the brutal details. She had been tortured, raped, and strangled. Morphine was found in her system, a cruel addition to the many ways she had suffered. The case had every hallmark of a violent and premeditated crime, yet the killer remained hidden, cloaked in shadows. The police followed every lead they could. Several suspects were considered, and evidence from the scene was gathered, samples of bodily fluids, clothing fibers, and anything else that could help identify the perpetrator. But despite all their efforts, the investigation failed to produce any definitive answers. The case seemed to slip further into the abyss of cold cases. What happened after Carla's murder left everyone wondering. How could such a brutal crime go unsolved for so long? For the next 4 decades, the investigation dragged on, yet the truth always seemed out of reach. The case was not abandoned, but it slowly faded into the backdrop as the years passed. The police continued to revisit old leads, but the killer's identity remained a mystery. The case went cold. Investigators explored every avenue, interviewing suspects and following new tips as they came in. There were even rumors that the killer had been in the area for some time, perhaps even living among the community without drawing attention. The breakthrough, though, was elusive. The case became a chilling reminder of just how fleeting justice can be. Then there was the mysterious letter. Months after Carla's body had been discovered, the Fort Worth Police Department received an anonymous letter. The writer claimed to know the identity of the killer. But the letter, instead of providing clarity, only added another layer of confusion. It was cryptic, vague, and ultimately unhelpful, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Despite this lead, the case remained unsolved, and over the years, the memory of the crime began to fade in the eyes of the public. Though the case was still considered a priority, it was far from the forefront of the department's daily concerns. The hunt for Carla's killer had become something of an afterthought, a haunting, unsolved mystery in the back of many minds. But even as time wore on, something stayed with the investigators. A sense that the killer was still out there, still hidden in plain sight. Fast forward to 2020, and everything changed. The case, which had remained unsolved for decades, was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. New technology had revolutionized the way evidence was handled, and in this case, it would finally provide the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. DNA technology had advanced to the point where even degraded and compromised samples could be analyzed. Enter Othram Incorporated, a lab specializing in such difficult cases. The Oxygen Network, determined to see this case resolved, funded the testing. The new DNA techniques allowed investigators to test evidence recovered from Carla's clothing, samples that had been preserved in a vault for over 4 decades. When the results came back, they were nothing short of shocking. The DNA matched a name that had long been dismissed during the original investigation: Glen Samuel McCurley. McCurley had been a suspect back in 1974. He was questioned after police discovered that he owned a .22 Ruger pistol, matching the magazine found at the crime scene. McCurley claimed that the gun had been stolen from his truck, and when he passed a polygraph test, he was cleared. At the time, this cleared him of suspicion, and the case continued without further leads. But in 2020, after years of investigation and modern DNA technology, McCurley's name resurfaced. The match was undeniable. The man who had been living in plain sight for all these years, quiet, unassuming, a man like any other, was finally revealed to be Carla Walker's killer. McCurley was arrested, and a new chapter in the long, unsolved case began. The investigation didn't just stop at McCurley's arrest. It reopened the possibility that McCurley may have been involved in other unsolved crimes. Detectives wondered whether he had been responsible for other murders and rapes in the Fort Worth area during the same time period. But those cases remained unsolved, and McCurley was never charged in connection with them. In August 2021, McCurley went to trial. The prosecution presented the damning evidence: the .22 Ruger pistol found in his home, the DNA samples that matched, and the confounding details of the case that had remained unsolved for decades. On the 3rd day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, facing life in prison. The man who had taken Carla's life finally admitted to the crime, though he never truly acknowledged the extent of his actions. For Carla's family, the plea brought closure, but it couldn't undo the pain of 46 years of unanswered questions. The case was closed, but the scars would never heal. And then, in July 2023, Glen McCurley passed away in prison, ending the life of a man who had destroyed so many others along the way. For those who lived through the trauma of Carla Walker's murder, the case remains a reminder of just how long justice can take, and how, sometimes, it is only through modern advancements in technology that we can uncover the truth hidden in the shadows. The man responsible for Carla Walker's brutal murder had been living freely, blending into society for decades. Glen Samuel McCurley, a name that would eventually become synonymous with one of the most shocking unresolved mysteries in Fort Worth, Texas, seemed like any other ordinary man. His life appeared unremarkable, and his past didn't raise any immediate red flags. Born in 1953, McCurley grew up in a small Texas town. He had no criminal history prior to Carla's murder, and on the surface, he led an unassuming life. He worked various jobs, lived in the same area for years, and even married and had children. To the community, he was just another neighbor, and no one suspected the dark secret he harbored. He lived among them, a shadow of his true self, until the DNA test revealed his chilling connection to Carla's murder. Back in 1974, when Carla Walker was killed, McCurley had briefly entered the police's radar. During the investigation, he was identified as a potential suspect after the magazine from his .22 Ruger pistol was found in the parking lot of the bowling alley where Carla was abducted. It was a significant lead, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime at the time. McCurley's version of events, he claimed his gun had been stolen, seemed plausible enough for law enforcement to clear him after he passed a polygraph test. This moment, though it now seemed like a tragic misstep, had led to the case going cold. McCurley had been cleared and faded from suspicion. For years, McCurley lived undisturbed, unaware that advancing technology would expose his past. His connection to Carla Walker's murder remained buried until DNA testing in 2020 identified him as the perpetrator. The same technology that once failed investigators now sealed his fate. His arrest shattered the illusion of an ordinary life. As news spread, Fort Worth was shaken. Carla's killer had been among them for decades. McCurley denied involvement, claiming the DNA evidence was wrong and that police coerced his confession. But faced with undeniable proof, he pled guilty in 2021. Even then, he never fully admitted to the crime. For Carla's family, justice brought relief but not closure. Nearly 50 years of uncertainty ended. Yet McCurley's silence left gaps. Did he have other victims? Police suspected him in other crimes, but no additional charges followed. The community was left questioning what else remained hidden. McCurley took his secrets to the grave when he died in prison in 2023. His conviction ended the case, but not the mystery. His refusal to speak denied the answers Carla's family and investigators sought. Justice had caught up to him, but the full truth remained elusive. What do you think about McCurley's case? Was justice served, or do you believe there are more victims out there? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what you think and discuss it with you. If you want to hear more shocking true crime stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Also, check out our other videos on unsolved mysteries. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. In our next video, we'll explore another case that took years to solve. You won't believe how it ended. Stay tuned.